Welcome to In and Around War, a podcast of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights on contemporary issues related to wars.
Welcome to In and Around Wars. My name is Juliette Graf, and I'm a research collaborator here at the Geneva Academy. In today's episode, we are talking about something that should be very simple, which is access to clean water. But in Gaza, water has become anything but simple. Right now, families are surviving on just 5 liters of water per day. That's less than what most of us would use to brush our teeth in the morning. And very often, that water is contaminated. Gaza has been under Israeli control since 1967, and its water situation has been documented and debated for decades. Recent research published in The Lancet shows drinking water availability has fallen by 94%. So the question is why? Is this the inevitable consequence of war or something else entirely? To help us unpack this, I'm joined by 3 very special guests. Lama Abdul Samad, who is a water and sanitation expert specializing in emergency contexts. She's part of Oxfam's global humanitarian team and set up their water response when Israel's war on Gaza began. She's also lead author of the paper Water War Crimes, documenting how Israel weaponized water in Gaza. Dr. Elvina Pothelet, who works for the IHL Centre as senior legal advisor and coordinator of the Jerusalem legal team. She's an international humanitarian law lawyer with 12 years of experience as both practitioner and academic. And finally, Stuart Casey-Maslen, our special advisor on the IHL in Focus project here at the Geneva Academy, which is a project that monitors compliance with international humanitarian law across 22 armed conflicts. Lama, let's start with you. What has happened to Gaza's water infrastructure and water availability since October 7th?
Israel has practiced systematic and widespread destruction of water infrastructure across the whole strip. On the 9th of October, 2 days after October 7 happened, Gallant, the former Prime Minister of Israel, declares a siege on Gaza, says there will be no more states, that there is no more water, food, electricity, everything is going to be blocked. He was absolutely true to his word. On the same day, they cut the water supply. Then, on the 31st of October, so 3 weeks later, they reactivated the water supply to Khan Yunis and to Deir al-Balah. But the water supply to Gaza City, the most populated area in Gaza, and, the area that was under evacuation order, Gaza City did not have water resumed until the 16th of May. So we're looking 6 months of no water supply, clean water supply. Then, of course, during the course of the war, very early on, we had reached a very high percentage of destruction of water infrastructure. And what do we mean by water infrastructure? It means wells, pumps, pipelines, reservoirs, tanks, treatment plants, desalination units. 75% of that infrastructure, which is essential for human life, was destroyed by Israel's military action. The result is drinking water supply dropped significantly to 40%. When people have been moved around, they are no longer living in their homes where the pipe of water reaches their tap. Even if they still lived in their homes, a lot of these pipes that deliver water have been bombed. So there is no water running in these taps. People have to reach the water, or someone has to take the water from where it is sourced to the people. We know that very few desalination, those small municipal ones, remained in operation. There were not enough trucks. There's no access to these water sources. People couldn't move around freely. And as we said, the pipes were broken. So in reality, water supply to the population, it ranges between 1 liter to something around 8 liters. So the report that you mentioned by The Lancet actually corroborates with the report I published last year. and corroborates with the latest data, which says we are at approximately 4 liters of water per person per day. People on the move have basically no water. People that are established in one location potentially can reach up to 8 liters of water. But this 8 liters of water, we need to be very clear that it does not meet the sphere minimum water quantity standard, which is set at 15 liters. This is in an acute emergency. We expect to give people 15 liters of water because this is water to drink, to cook, to wash your clothes, to clean your house. All of this is with 15 liters. What is 4 liters? It is basically less than a toilet flush. Where you live, where I live, it is less than a toilet flush.
Thanks, Lama, for those numbers that are just staggering. I mean, 4 liters of water per day is barely survival level. What you're describing connects directly to our new Geneva Academy Spot report, which examines this crisis under international humanitarian law. In this report, we call what's happening the weaponization of water. Stuart, you supervise this research, and you've spent years analyzing how international law governs targeting in war. When we say the weaponization of water, what does that actually mean legally? What are the rules about attacking civilian water infrastructure?
There are rules that regulate how warring parties behave. I know it might not seem like that when we look around conflicts, including Gaza and others today, but there are rules that exist. And there are rules that apply generally to what you can attack and when you can attack it and how you can attack it. And then there are issues that are specific, of course, to water, which is so essential. The first, and this is arguably the most fundamental of all the rules of what we call international humanitarian law, and that is the rule of distinction. That means you cannot target civilians or civilian objects. You must target only military personnel and military objectives. The problem, I would say, is that a military objective in international humanitarian law is defined quite broadly. It's not just something that we know is military, like a tank or a soldier, but it's also what we would ordinarily consider to be civilian, and that includes water, desalination, reservoirs, and so on, but where they are being used by the military. And in theory, even a relatively small percentage of military use can suffice to turn a civilian object into a military objective. But that is not where the law ends. Just because the military is using something doesn't mean that you can necessarily attack it. And that's because of another rule that we call proportionality. You have to balance as an attacker what you expect to get out of the military advantage of attacking something set against the harm that you expect to be caused to civilians and civilian objects. And of course, harm to water sources, damage to desalination plants is going to be particularly acute. And that leads us to the third of our key rules. That is the total prohibition, even if you're attacking something that is military, even if the perceived military advantage is significant, if what you do is likely to cause the starvation of the civilian population, food, water, electricity, and so on, then you are completely prohibited from attacking it. And I'm sad to say that in Gaza, I think we've seen widespread, one might even say systematic violations of each of those principles: distinction, proportionality in attack, and starvation as a method of warfare.
Yeah. And what really strikes me from our spot report is that this isn't random damage. We're seeing a real pattern. We see the infrastructure get hit, maybe it gets repaired, and then it gets hit again. As you say, it's systematic. So how is that different legally from normal collateral damage that we would see in war?
So we have our obligations, and those obligations that I've talked about are so fundamental to the protection of the civilian population that they apply to all warring parties, irrespective of whether they're a state or not, irrespective of whether they've joined a particular treaty or not. That fundamental nature also means that these obligations are criminalized. That means they become international crimes, war crimes, and also crimes against humanity when there is a widespread or systematic attack on civilians. That criminal nature means that individuals, and there are two that have been indicted by the International Criminal Court on this basis, the Israeli Prime Minister and the former Israeli Minister of Defense, they have been indicted for war crimes, and that includes starvation as a method of warfare. This is not something that occurs often, and I think it shows the severity and the extent, and as you said, the fact that this is not a happenstance. This is not the incidental casualty of war, but actually this is what we describe as a war on water, the attacks on water facilities, the blockages, and the prevention of the civilian population getting even the most fundamental elements in order to survive.
Lama, could you walk us through what it's like trying to provide water services in Gaza right now? What happens when organizations like Oxfam try to get supplies in?
So I'll start off by saying that obviously the water utility had, prior to October 2023, warehouses where they kept the pipes, the spare parts, the chlorine used to disinfect the water. And they also had laboratories, 3 laboratories, to test water and sanitation water prior to sending it to the population. Now, this is what we call assets. All 100% of all assets, all the warehouses and all the laboratories were taken out early in the conflict, right? So that meant that even as a water utility, it could not cope because all of its reserves were exhausted. They were blown up. So the only choice was to get pipes, spare parts, everything, chlorine for disinfection, laboratories, chemical requirements through the borders, or we can't call them borders, they're actually designated crossings into Gaza, and nothing really goes through, right? So when you look at, for example, pipes and tanks, Oxfam, the UN, UNICEF, ICRC puts in requests, and it will take months and months and months of back and forth with COGAT, and COGAT is the coordination entity by the Israeli government that governs the entry and exit of material into and people in and out of Gaza. And they need to provide you the security clearance, do all the checks, and allow you to enter or not. Those approvals never, ever are granted. I'll give you an example. As I said earlier, Oxfam had manufactured 5 desalination units inside Gaza with the available material. This was not going to be enough, so we manufactured 6 desalination small units in Cairo. These, alongside 4 mobile laboratories that we just brought in from our UK warehouses, they have sat at the border in Rafah since January 2024. We have still not been cleared to get critical humanitarian items into the Gaza Strip. We also have over $200,000 worth of pipes and fittings that are stuck at the northern border since March 2024. These have also not entered the Gaza Strip. Yeah. So we need to be clear. Nothing of any value is allowed to enter Gaza without unprecedented amounts of effort to get it in. And the last thing I really want to say to this is that the water sources of Gaza are the cleaner ones, are the ones that are on the eastern side, so away from the sea, right? Today, the whole population is at the coast. So we are only able really to use those water sources that we know are the most highly polluted. In the populated area, in the central area of Gaza, there are 19 small desalinization units. If you look at the latest evacuation order for that region, you will see that out of those 19, 9 are now out of access. You cannot access them. They're out of reach because now they're in the red zone. So there is a really big challenge for anyone, the water utility, for the UN, or NGOs, to perform the basic tasks of providing water to the population.
And perhaps we can start with the basics. And Elvina, this is where we'll need your legal expertise. The IHL Centre has been analyzing Israel's obligations here. Under international humanitarian law, who is actually responsible for making sure civilians have water in a situation like this?
Thanks, Juliette, for this question, which indeed is an important starting point, because when we discuss how to respond to the needs of civilians in Gaza, their needs in terms of water, of food, of other essential supplies, we often focus on the provision of relief by humanitarian organizations, right? But let's not forget that the party supposed to supply civilians in the first place is Israel. International humanitarian law is very clear about this because Israel is an occupying power in Gaza, and that's a view shared by multiple authorities, including the International Court of Justice. It has heightened responsibilities towards the civilian population, and this entails a duty to itself procure essential supplies. So including food and medical supplies, water, shelter items, clothing, fuel and electricity to ensure that not only water installations run properly, but also hospitals, etc. And so evidently Israel has been failing to discharge this obligation, right? Not only it's not providing, but it's actually blocking or at least obstructing the entry of supplies, both commercial and relief supplies, by the way. And so when we are sort of taking stock of the multiple violations committed by Israel in connection to the needs of civilians in Gaza, the very first violation, if you will, is this one, is the failure to provide. So the population in Gaza is currently inadequately supplied. This sounds like a terrible euphemism in Gaza where the population is literally starving, but it's the legal standard under Article 59 of the Fourth Geneva Convention, right? Where the population is inadequately supplied. And because Israel fails to provide for its needs, then it has a legal duty to consent to humanitarian relief offered by others, such as impartial humanitarian organizations. And once it has consented to such relief, it must allow and facilitate the passage of this relief subject to a right of control. And maybe we can discuss the limits of this right later. But to answer your question, the primary responsibility to meet the needs of the population in Gaza falls on Israel, and it must do so by meeting those needs itself or failing this by consenting to humanitarian activities provided by external actors. And perhaps a final clarification is that Israel's decision to outsource the delivery of supplies by private actors, like the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, in no way diminishes its obligations under international humanitarian law. It adds a layer of responsibility because these private actors can be held responsible for contributing to the war crimes committed by Israel, but this does not displace Israel's obligations under international law.
So when Lama describes all these supplies that are stuck at crossings that Israel controls, Israel is clearly not fulfilling its legal obligations in that sense.
Indeed, exactly.
So Israeli officials say Hamas diverts humanitarian aid, so they need strict restrictions to prevent that. Lama just told us that the UN and the ICRC, they negotiate for months just to get water tanks through. Legally speaking, do security concerns justify blocking such supplies?
Yeah, thank you again, because it's a very important point for clarification, because the risk of aid diversion is often instrumentalized to distort the law and to deny humanitarian aid altogether to affected populations. And in Gaza, that's exactly what we see, right? The alleged diversion of aid by Hamas has been the main pretext used by Israel for drastically restricting the entry of supplies and for even completely sealing off the strip, including until last May for a 3-month period. And by the way, UN and impartial humanitarian organizations operating in Gaza have consistently denied these claims of diversion of aid. And in fact, just a few weeks ago, a USAID study actually found no evidence that Hamas has been systematically diverting aid. So that's for the facts, right? Now, as to the law, as mentioned earlier, Israel has a duty to consent to humanitarian relief and then to allow and facilitate the passage of such relief, which means that it must grant all facilities needed for humanitarian organizations to basically do their job. But this duty is indeed subject to what we call a right of control. So concretely, Israel is entitled to control humanitarian relief consignments, indeed to ensure that they are not diverted from their destination, but also that they are indeed humanitarian in nature, that they won't get attacked, etc. And so in this framework, it can impose some technical arrangements for the delivery of the assistance, for instance, imposing specific routes or times for the delivery. It can search the consignments, etc. But these measures of control, they must meet a number of criteria. I won't go into details now, but interested listeners can refer to some of the reports that the IHL Centre recently published. I wanted to highlight one key consideration in that regard, and that is the fact that the modalities, these technical arrangements, they must not unduly delay the delivery of humanitarian aid, and obviously they must not make it impossible to deliver the supplies. So the relevant standard is whether the population is indeed adequately supplied, or in plain terms, whether the needs are met. And so with this legal background in mind, and looking at the reality in Gaza today, where famine has been officially declared, with hundreds of malnutrition-related deaths, where 80% of all structures have been destroyed, where critical shortages of medicines make it impossible for health services to provide patients with the care they need, where 90% of the population has been displaced, living in inhuman conditions in displacement sites. I mean, all of this indicates that it's evident that the conditions imposed by Israel on the delivery of relief in Gaza don't even come close to meeting the legal standard, no matter the justification.
And Elvina, you briefly mentioned the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, which was established by Israel in May 2025. So it essentially requires all aid to go through this entity, which is completely Israeli controlled, rather than directly to a new UN agency or organizations like Oxfam. What's your assessment of this controversial mechanism?
Sure. So indeed, Israel has been imposing this mechanism since last May for the distribution of supplies in Gaza. And essentially, this mechanism entails a very limited number of distribution points in the strip, so 4 distribution points exactly, as opposed to hundreds previously. It forces civilians to pass through heavily militarized areas to access the sites. It imposes the use of armed actors to oversee the distribution. And as you mentioned, there has been only one supplier so far that has accepted to operate under this mechanism, and this is the so-called Gaza Humanitarian Foundation. The outcomes of this mechanism have been quite predictably disastrous. The supplies delivered have been wholly insufficient. The conditions of delivery have been undignified, and in fact, they have been deadly. There is more than 1,000 people who have been killed around the sites and dozens of thousands more injured. And in terms of the assessment of the IHL Centre from a legal standpoint, well, the mechanism entails a number of violations by IHL.
Mm-hmm. What's really emerging here is layers of obstruction. First, we see the infrastructure getting destroyed, then the repair materials getting blocked, then the aid delivery getting restricted. Clearly, these aren't isolated problems. They're all just compounding each other. Now that we have examined the legal violations and the blocked aid, Behind all of this are 2.2 million people trying to survive. Lama, you work on water systems, but you also see how this crisis affects families directly. What does the hygiene and sanitation situation look like when people are surviving on 5 liters of contaminated water per day?
Listen, it's extremely difficult to maintain good hygiene practices when you don't have the hygiene items, when you're constantly on the move, when you are exhausted. Let's look at this summer. Let's forget it. In winter, it'll rain and Gaza will flood and there will be puddles and puddles of water everywhere. In summer, the temperatures will rise above 40 degrees Celsius. People are evacuating all the time from one place to the next. If you had to evacuate, would you take your shampoo? No, there's more important items that you have to take if you have to walk for kilometers and kilometers and kilometers with your life on your back. You only have 4 liters of water per person per day. With all of this, it's very compounding. People are not able to maintain good hygiene practices, even if they wanted to. Hygiene always drops when people are under severe trauma. Okay, you drink and you cook with this water, but the rest you have to use for your hygiene. Maybe you will use some of it to wash your body at 40 plus degrees Celsius. How are you going to wash your clothes? Is it safe to go to the sea and wash your clothes? Is it? I mean, I asked this question. I don't know. I wonder what it would be like for me if I lived in Gaza and I had 4 liters of water, 8 liters of water to do everything in a scorching hot summer, living in a plastic tent. How do I manage? And I think these are very valid questions around people's hygiene practices. So, no, I don't think people are capable of maintaining good hygiene practices.
Lama, thank you for bringing us back to the human reality behind these legal violations. So to end this discussion, I think we need to address the elephant in the room. I'd like to ask each of you directly, what relevance does international humanitarian law actually have today?
I'd argue it's actually more relevant than ever. The fact that there are systematic violations by Israel, by Hamas, by the warring parties in a number of countries around the world only makes promoting respect for IHL more important. We are not naive, we're under no illusions about the severity of the challenge, but the actions or inactions that we take now will have consequences for years and decades beyond. We're already seeing the consequences of the violations in the aftermath of 9/11 that have resonated across conflicts. If the United States is able to do this and thinks it's okay, then why aren't we able to do this and think it's okay? And there is our challenge, that no one comes out of this conflict with any credit, no one. But what we do now at this point in time will have implications for what warring parties do in the future. And so hopefully people will say the war must stop, the hostages must go home, Gaza must be rebuilt, and we must never do this again.
Well, it's hard to go after Stuart because I think he said it all already. I guess maybe let me take a slightly different take at your question, Juliette. You assume in your question that all of what we've discussed constitute violations of the law, and I agree. I think we all agree under this table, and yet I'm very often surprised that this is not as clear for everybody. You know, when you are listening to some commentaries today about what's going on in Gaza, about the rules applicable in Gaza, including on some of Israel's basic duties when it comes to preserving the lives and dignity of civilians in Gaza, you somehow get the impression that all of this is complicated, right? I mean, sometimes I get the feeling of legal gaslighting almost. But you also started with this episode, Juliette, by reminding us that some things are simple, like access to water, needs to access to water. Well, I mean, I think things can also be very simple when it comes to the law. And in fact, IHL was designed to be a fairly simple body of rules, right? It was meant to be applied by people, namely commanders and their soldiers, operating in the most dire of circumstances. So it is meant to be easily understandable. It is true that it has a core protective function, but it also has a very pragmatic function to it, right? And so I guess what I'm getting at is a call for common sense when it comes to applying and interpreting the law. And I guess I'm speaking here also maybe mostly to third states. If there are third states listening to us, still unsure about whether it is legally required for them to act today vis-a-vis what Israel is doing in Gaza, things are simple. And I would really encourage them to exert common sense when assessing what's going on. Just to take the subject that we've been discussing throughout this episode, namely answering the basic needs of civilians when you have famine officially declared on a territory. And on the other hand, you have a party with full control over what can get in and who can get in the territory. And the same party has been destroying 80% of the structures in Gaza. You know, things are simple. They're not that complicated. So let's please all use common sense when we talk about the law and when we want to distinguish between what is an interpretation of the law, permissive interpretation of the law, and what is simply a violation, as you said, Juliette.
I think from where I sit, and I am not a lawyer, maybe I consider myself a citizen of the world. And your question for me is very pertinent. My question back to you is the frustration that with the law, or is it the frustration with the politics? And I think that's worlds apart. I fully agree with my colleagues. The law is there, and it doesn't need to be so complicated. What politics chooses to do with it, and how nation states are manipulating these things, that's another story. For me, personally, I fully respect the law and the efforts of the legal apparatus around the world, the International Court of Justice, the ICC, all these lawyers, and I see the effort. And for me, it is no longer about achieving peace. It is about achieving justice. Justice to the people that have fallen, justice to the people that continue to be ill and ill-treated and at risk every day, and to the future generations to come. And if we want justice, we need people to respect law. It's not the problem of the law, it's the problem of the politics. Thank you.
Stuart, Elvina, Lama, thank you for your time today, your expertise, and for all the work that you do. This was In and Around Wars. Thank you for listening.
You've been listening to In and Around Wars, a podcast of the Geneva Academy of International Humanitarian Law and Human Rights. If you've enjoyed this episode, don't forget to subscribe and stay tuned for more inspiring conversations. You can also check the Geneva Academy's website, geneva-academy.ch, to find more resources and upcoming events on contemporary issues of international humanitarian law and policy.